The cabin lights hummed softly as the flight cruised at 35,000 feet. Steven Seagal, dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, leaned back in his first-class seat, quietly scrolling through his phone. He wasn't looking for attention, just another traveler in a crowded airplane. A flight attendant, mid-20s, brisk and officious, approached him with a clipboard in hand. Her brow furrowed the instant she looked at him. "Sir, excuse me. Can I see your ticket and ID?" she asked, her tone sharp. Steven raised his eyes calmly and handed over his boarding pass. "Of course," he said, voice steady. "Here's everything you need." The attendant glanced at the ticket but barely made eye contact. "Sir, you're in the wrong seat," she insisted. "This is for a different passenger. Step aside, please." Passengers nearby began to notice the exchange. A man in business attire leaned forward from his seat. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. A whisper ran through the cabin. "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal?" Steven stayed still, composed. "My ticket is correct. You can check it again." His calm tone only seemed to frustrate the attendant more. She leaned closer, her voice rising slightly. "Sir, I said move. We have a priority passenger waiting for this seat." Steven looked around. Some passengers were already filming on their phones. Others whispered to one another, exchanging nervous glances. The tension in first class had grown palpable. An ordinary flight had turned into a scene of quiet confrontation. "I understand," Steven said evenly, holding out his ID. "I've done nothing wrong. Let's handle this properly." But the attendant seemed uninterested in properly. Her face flushed as she repeated, "Sir, you need to step out. Now." A few people gasped. A mother held her child close. Others pulled out their phones, anticipating a scene. Yet Steven didn't flinch. He stood slowly, towering over the attendant but without aggression. His eyes remained calm, unreadable and commanding. What Steven did next shocked everyone on that plane, and forced the flight crew to rethink everything they thought they knew about who he was. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted. Passengers no longer whispered quietly, they were leaning forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene as if sensing that something historic was happening mid-air. Steven Seagal remained calm, almost serene, while the flight attendant's frustration was growing visibly. "Sir, I've asked you to step aside," she snapped, her voice sharper now, carrying across the aisle. "This is not a request." Steven handed over his ID again, placing it gently in her hand. "Everything is in order. Please check it properly before asking me to move," he said, his tone low and deliberate. There was no anger, no hesitation, just quiet authority. A few passengers began speaking up. "Is this really necessary?" a man in the row behind called, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He's done nothing wrong." The flight attendant ignored him, her eyes darting toward the small group of first-class passengers who were now fully watching. She took a deep breath and leaned closer to Steven. "I don't care who you are. You're taking a seat that belongs to another passenger. Step aside now." A soft murmur ran through the cabin, growing louder as more people realized this confrontation was escalating. Some passengers were shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering, "I can't believe she's treating him like this." Steven's companion, seated just a few rows back, his assistant for the day, whispered nervously, "Steven, maybe just step back. Let her handle it. It's not worth the trouble." Steven shook his head slowly. "I've done nothing wrong. I will not leave my seat because someone assumes I should." His voice was calm but firm, carrying across the aisle in a way that drew even more attention. A teen nearby, recording on their phone, whispered excitedly to a friend, "Isn't that Steven Seagal?" The friend's jaw dropped. A few other passengers started pointing discreetly, murmuring to one another. The flight attendant's hands tightened around her clipboard. Her face flushed red. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to call the supervisor," she threatened, her voice now sharp enough that it made other passengers flinch. Steven's gaze remained steady, unshaken. "Go ahead. Call whoever you need to. I've done nothing wrong." Some passengers began murmuring in support. "He's right. He has every right to sit there," one whispered to a friend. Another passenger quietly filmed the interaction, narrating, "This is ridiculous. He's a passenger like anyone else." The tension in the cabin was now almost tangible. People were leaning from their seats, whispering, recording, some clutching their armrests as if waiting for the confrontation to escalate further. Even as the attendant took a step back, attempting to assert authority, Steven remained composed, showing no sign of fear or anger. He exuded the quiet confidence of someone used to high-stakes situations. But this time, it was in a completely unexpected arena. Mid-flight, surrounded by ordinary passengers who were silently rooting for him. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly by authority? Comment below. Also, tell us which country and city you're watching this from. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The plane continued to hum along, oblivious to the silent tension in first class, while Steven Seagal sat tall, unyielding and dignified. The passengers' whispers and phone cameras documented every second, and it was clear that this was no ordinary mid-air disagreement. It was a moment that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost electric. Every passenger in first class had shifted, drawn into the standoff. Steven Seagal remained seated, his posture straight, eyes calm but unwavering, while the flight attendant's frustration reached a boiling point. "Sir, I am serious," she snapped, leaning toward him again. "If you don't move now, I'll have to involve the supervisor, and you may be removed from the flight." Steven looked up slowly, his expression measured. "I understand your concern," he said evenly. "But I've shown you my ticket and ID. There's no reason to remove me. I'm a paying passenger just like anyone else." Passengers around them were now whispering in disbelief, some shaking their heads. A woman in the row behind muttered, "Can you believe she's threatening him like that? He's done nothing wrong." Several others discreetly filmed the exchange, their phones pointed at the confrontation. The flight attendant's voice rose another octave, almost shouting now. "You don't get to argue with me. I have rules to follow. Step aside." Steven's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her aggression. He remained seated, shoulders squared, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm asking you to follow the rules fairly," he said. "I've complied. Please respect that." The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Some passengers were standing slightly, trying not to interfere but clearly showing support. A few whispered to each other, "She's gone too far," or, "Why is he being treated like this?" His assistant, seated nearby, leaned toward him nervously. "Steven, maybe just let it go. Don't escalate." Steven shook his head slowly. "I will not be humiliated for no reason," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm not going anywhere because someone assumes I should." The flight attendant's hand hovered near her radio, fingers twitching. She seemed ready to call for backup. A male passenger leaned forward from the middle row, speaking up cautiously, "Sir, maybe you should just move." Steven's eyes met his. "And let injustice stand unchecked?" he replied softly. The weight of his presence silenced the passenger instantly. Other travelers were now whispering excitedly, some inching closer with their phones ready, documenting the standoff. A tense hush fell over first class as the attendant straightened, glancing around nervously at the passengers who had begun murmuring their disapproval. Some whispered, "He's calm, he's right," while others exchanged incredulous looks. Steven's voice, low but resolute, cut through the tension. "I have done nothing wrong. I am a passenger on this flight, and I will not be treated with disrespect." The flight attendant's confidence faltered slightly as the murmurs of support grew louder. The crowd around them was no longer just observing, they were silently taking sides. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, armed with their phones and quiet indignation, were a silent army backing Steven. If you were standing there as a bystander, would you step in or stay quiet? Type your answer in the comments. The plane continued its steady hum, yet inside the cabin, it felt like a storm was brewing. Every passenger could feel the gravity of the moment. Steven Seagal, seated calmly, refusing to be intimidated, and the flight attendant, red-faced, wavering between authority and embarrassment. For the first time, it seemed like this confrontation might actually spiral, but the calm determination of one man had begun to shift the balance. The tide was slowly turning, and the passengers were watching, waiting, silently rooting for fairness to prevail. The tension in the cabin had reached a fever pitch. Passengers were leaning slightly out of their seats, phones in hand, whispers floating through the rows like a current. Amid the quiet murmurs, a teenage passenger sitting near the window nudged her friend and whispered urgently, "Isn't that Steven Seagal?" Her friend's eyes widened. "No way. That's him. That's Steven Seagal." Suddenly, the cabin's perspective began to shift. More passengers glanced at him, recognizing the familiar face of the martial arts icon and Hollywood actor. A woman in the aisle whispered to her husband, "That's the guy from all those action movies." Despite the growing recognition, the flight attendant remained oblivious. She continued addressing Steven as though he were just another passenger, her voice tight with frustration. "Sir, I've asked you to move. Please comply," she repeated, clearly unaware of the identity that now had half the cabin whispering and filming. Steven, sensing the subtle shift in the crowd, remained composed. He didn't acknowledge the recognition. He never bragged, never flaunted his fame. His calm, quiet presence spoke volumes on its own. Passengers who recognized him began speaking up, softly at first. "You don't have to treat him that way," one murmured. "He's a paying passenger just like the rest of us." A man near the back raised his phone, not to record Steven but to discreetly capture the attendant's confrontational tone. "This isn't right," he whispered. The crowd's whispers and gestures began to swell into low murmurs of support. Some passengers leaned forward, making eye contact with the flight attendant in ways that subtly communicated their disapproval. One young woman, seated near the front, whispered to a friend, "Can you believe she doesn't recognize him?" The attendant's cheeks flushed red, her confidence visibly waning. She glanced nervously at the passengers who were clearly documenting everything and realizing that public opinion had begun quietly siding with Steven. The murmurs and stares made it harder for her to maintain authority. Even though Steven still didn't speak of his fame, his silent dignity amplified the imbalance. The passengers had started defending him, standing as a subtle wall of accountability. It became clear to the attendant that her actions were no longer private, they were being scrutinized by dozens of eyes and cameras. Steven's assistant leaned over quietly. "They're starting to realize who you are," she whispered. Steven nodded slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "It doesn't matter," he said softly. "I'm still just a passenger. What matters is how people are treated." The crowd's energy shifted perceptibly. There was now a sense of collective awareness. The passengers understood that injustice was happening in front of them. Many subtly began filming, whispering among themselves, or leaning forward as if ready to intervene verbally if the situation escalated further. The attendant, now visibly unsettled, took a deep breath and tried to assert control, but the recognition and growing support for Steven made her words falter. She realized, too late, that the quiet power of a man who refused to be intimidated, and the murmurs of a cabin full of witnesses, was far stronger than her authority. Have you ever been in a situation where someone was treated unfairly in public? Share your story in the comments below. Steven Seagal remained seated, dignified and calm, while the whispers of recognition circulated through the cabin. The dynamic had shifted completely. What had started as a confrontation was now a silent reckoning, and the passengers were quietly rallying around the man who had handled an impossible situation with grace. The cabin had become a stage of quiet tension. Every passenger could feel it, the subtle, electric energy of an unfolding confrontation. The flight attendant, red-faced and clearly frustrated, had lost some of her earlier confidence. Yet she still pressed on, stepping closer to Steven with a sharp edge in her voice. "You think you're above the rules?" she demanded. "I've asked you politely and now I'm serious. Move." Steven looked up slowly, his piercing gaze steady. He didn't rise, didn't argue angrily. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, hands resting calmly on the armrests. His presence alone seemed to slow the rapid heartbeat of the cabin. "I've complied with every request," he said evenly. "I've shown you my ticket and ID. I have done nothing to warrant this treatment." A low murmur ran through the passengers. Some leaned forward from their seats, others shifted to get a better view, phones recording discreetly. Whispers spread, "She's insulting him now, this is ridiculous." The attendant's voice cracked slightly as she raised it again. "You don't get to talk back to me." Steven's assistant whispered nervously, "Steven, maybe just ignore her. Let it go." Steven shook his head slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "No. Respect is not optional. I will not allow myself, or anyone else, to be humiliated without reason." His words carried a weight that seemed to ripple across the cabin. Passengers who had been quietly watching began to nod, murmuring their agreement. A man in the aisle whispered, "Finally, someone standing up." Another leaned forward and muttered, "This is exactly how it should be handled, calm, firm, respectful." The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly, gripping her clipboard harder. She took a step back, suddenly aware of the eyes watching her judgment. The once quiet authority she wielded now felt fragile in the face of the collective disapproval. Steven's voice rose just slightly, firm but not angry. "I will not move because someone assumes I should. I am a paying passenger, and I deserve to be treated with fairness and dignity." The cabin fell silent. Even passengers who hadn't been paying close attention paused, sensing the gravity of the moment. Steven's calm courage had shifted the balance completely. The murmurs of support became louder, People were no longer whispering but quietly affirming him. Jaws tightened, eyes focused. The flight attendant now realized she had crossed a line. She was no longer in control. The passengers had silently rallied behind Steven Seagal, their collective awareness and quiet resistance amplifying his words. Steven's assistant, visibly relieved, smiled faintly. The tension that had gripped them all began to ease slightly, replaced by admiration. The cabin was witnessing not a confrontation, but a stand for fairness, dignity, and justice. Have you ever had to stand your ground when treated unfairly? Tell us how you handled it in the comments below. Steven remained seated, unshaken and composed. His firm yet calm response had not only silenced the immediate hostility but had also earned the quiet respect of the passengers around him. The confrontation had reached a turning point, one that would ultimately expose the flight attendant's misjudgment and shift the power entirely. The cabin was tense but electric. Passengers sat forward, phones out, whispers circulating like wildfire. The flight attendant, red-faced and flustered, tried to regain composure, but her earlier aggression had clearly faltered. It was at that moment the cockpit door opened, and the supervisor appeared. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, approached the scene. He glanced at the seated passenger, then froze for just a second. Recognition dawned immediately. "Wait, you're Steven Seagal?" he asked, voice low but incredulous. The murmurs grew louder. Some passengers whispered to each other, "He's famous, he really is Steven Seagal." Others peeked at their screens, realizing the identity of the man who had been so calmly holding his ground. The flight attendant's confidence crumbled entirely. She stammered, I didn't know, sir. I thought." The supervisor raised a hand gently, interrupting her. "Ma'am, you were completely wrong to treat him this way," he said firmly, addressing her now. "Steven Seagal is a paying passenger, and he has every right to remain in his seat. You embarrassed yourself in the airline." Steven, seated and calm, simply nodded. "I appreciate you recognizing that," he said quietly. "What matters is that passengers are treated with fairness, not assumptions based on appearance." The passengers around them murmured in agreement. A few clapped lightly, some even recording the exchange, documenting the moment when the power dynamic had finally shifted. The flight attendant's face burned with embarrassment, realizing the extent of the mistake she had made under the watchful eyes of both the supervisor and the cabin full of passengers. I just wanted to enforce the rules," she muttered weakly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Rules must be applied correctly, not selectively," Steven replied, his voice calm but firm. "Judgment based on assumptions is the problem here. Respect should always come first." The supervisor nodded, looking at the cabin. Everyone witnessed the situation. "I'll handle this formally," he said, giving the attendant a clear signal that her actions were being documented. The passengers began whispering excitedly among themselves. Phones were still raised, capturing every word. Some smiled subtly at Steven, impressed by his poise and dignity under pressure. Others shook their heads at the attendant, incredulous that the confrontation had escalated as it did. Steven's assistant leaned in quietly. "You handled that perfectly," she whispered. Steven nodded. "It's not about me," he said softly. "It's about fairness and treating people properly, no matter who they are." The cabin had shifted from tension to quiet admiration. Passengers were now subtly rallying behind him, murmuring about the importance of respect, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what is right. The attendant, still flustered, could do nothing but step aside as the supervisor took control. "Do you think the flight attendant deserves to lose her job after this incident? Share your opinion in the comments below." By the time the flight resumed its quiet hum, Steven Seagal remained composed, seated calmly, a picture of dignity and quiet authority. The incident had transformed mid-flight, from confrontation to a public lesson in respect, recognition, and the consequences of misjudgment. The passengers, now fully aware of what they had witnessed, were left with a story they would remember long after landing. A story of calm courage prevailing over rash assumptions. By the time the flight touched down, the cabin was buzzing, not with tension but with excitement. Passengers whispered to one another, exchanging glances and smiles, many reviewing the videos they had recorded. What had started as a tense confrontation had transformed into a story of calm courage, fairness, and respect. News of the incident spread quickly. Passengers shared clips on social media, and within hours the story had gone viral. Headlines flashed across Twitter, Instagram, and news websites. Steven Seagal stands firm after flight attendant's insults. Action star handles mid-air humiliation with calm authority, and flight attendant faces backlash after confronting Steven Seagal. The public reaction was immediate. Fans praised Steven's composure, his patience, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. Comment sections filled with admiration. "That's how you stand up for yourself without losing control." And "True heroism isn't in fighting, it's in calm strength." The flight attendant faced swift consequences. The airline initiated an internal investigation, and soon it became clear that she had crossed professional boundaries. Public opinion weighed heavily against her, and she was suspended pending further review. Passengers who had been on the flight posted statements, emphasizing the contrast between Steven's calm professionalism and the attendant's rude behavior. Steven, meanwhile, remained gracious. In a brief statement, he addressed the situation with humility and wisdom. No one should be judged by their appearance. Every passenger deserves respect, and every employee should uphold that standard, regardless of assumptions. It's about dignity, not fame. The passengers on the flight reflected on what they had witnessed. Many said they had never seen someone handle injustice with such patience and poise. The videos continued to circulate, with millions watching the moment Steven's quiet strength forced a shift in authority mid-air. Journalists highlighted not just the celebrity factor, but the broader message. Fairness, respect, and equality are not optional. Steven's calm reaction had reminded the public that courage is not always loud or aggressive. It can be measured, deliberate, and principled. Even days later, the incident remained trending online. Analysts discussed how a single individual acting with dignity could change the behavior of authority figures and influence public perception in real time. The viral footage became an example of standing up against discrimination and unfair treatment, inspiring conversations about professionalism and accountability. If you believe in respect and equality, type respect in the comments. By the time Steven reflected privately on the ordeal, he didn't dwell on the confrontation itself, nor the headlines. What mattered most to him was the lesson it had imparted, that standing firm, speaking calmly, and demanding fair treatment can make a difference, not just for oneself but for everyone watching. The flight had ended, but the story had taken on a life of its own. In living rooms, offices, and on phones around the world, millions now saw the quiet power of composure. Steven Seagal had reminded everyone that true strength is not measured by fists or fame, but by integrity, dignity, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even 35,000 feet in the air.